All right. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. I really do appreciate your time. And it's really fun for me to be here because I'm from Canada. It is decidedly colder there than it is here. So I've been here for about 24 hours, and my body is still adjusting. So if I burst into flames suddenly, you'll know why. Canadians are somewhat flammable in that regard. So I have been doing security in one form or another now for 3 decades. Along the way, I have had all sorts of different jobs. I have been a CISO, I've been a firewall admin, and all points in between. And it's really amazing the different twists and turns that life takes you as you're going along. And I should point out that I am Canadian, but it is not contagious. Now, we spent the last couple of years dealing with pandemic and all that sort of thing, so we had all these soul-crushing meetings. There was one company the other day that just announced that they are not doing meetings anymore if there's more than 2 people on a call. They're just saying canceling it. So they canceled 76,000 meetings. It'll be really interesting to see how they're actually going to be able to get things done in a collaborative fashion. But when we're looking at the security industry overall, we know that there are some things out there that just really aren't right. And we have to be able to learn when to be able to put up our hand and say, that is not going to work for me. I should apologize to the camera operator at this point because I do walk around a lot, and if I leave the stage, nothing personal, and I'm apologizing in advance. I've been doing this so long that I got my start in 1983. In 1983, I was duping video games and selling them to other kids in school using our science teacher's computer. And it was just because a buddy and I were messing around. We figured out how to do it, and we had a tidy little business on the side. It was really fun. And then a little while later, my dad brought one of these home from work. He had no idea what to do with it other than using a spreadsheet program called VisiCalc. If anybody, there's one that knows it. That was a precursor to Excel and everything else in between. And it was amazing just being able to go through this and learn how to operate it. I was so fascinated. And this was a natural curiosity that was born out of my childhood. Both of my grandfathers served in World War II. One was a defender, one was a merchant marine. So I got to really see the attack and defend perspective in a supply chain way of looking at things. And this really came back to me as I was flying into Singapore yesterday, and I saw this from the window of my plane. And I was like, I know that picture. I've been there. And it's crazy when we look at this and we see all of those ships and the amount of cargo that those things can move and the patterns that they fall there. The patterns that they go. I'll apologize right now. I'm on 4 hours sleep, and I'm completely jet-lagged. I don't know which way is up. So if I stumble, my apologies. So here's an example of shipping lanes all over the world. This is just a physical aspect. Now try an overlay of all the internet pipes. It is absolutely staggering to see all the different things that are out there from a networking perspective, both physical and virtual. And the things that we have to deal with today and how we're securing these networks and how we're securing our environments really had a much earlier start than we ever give it credit for. If you've ever seen me give a talk before, there's a 90% chance you've heard me give this tale. So before I got into computer security, I was doing a degree in archaeology. How I got there is a much longer story for another day. But one of the really interesting lessons of this event, or this part of my career, was that I learned about the sack of Rome in 410 AD. The Visigoths showed up, they surrounded the city of Rome, cut off all access in and out, and they waited. They didn't launch an assault, they didn't launch a barrage, they waited. Until the Romans ran out of food, ran out of water, ran out of all their supplies, they just opened the doors and said, we give up. In 410 AD, the Visigoths were able to show demonstrably that what we look at as perimeter-based security was broken. So why do we still look at it from that perspective? The one thing I learned is castles simply don't scale. When we're looking at it from a security perspective in the cyber realm, for want of a better term, we have to make sure that we put on a different hat. Because we tend to make a lot of the same mistakes over and over again. I've been in a lot of environments over the years, both as full-time staff and as a contractor and a consultant. And my favorite is in almost every DR and BCP document, that's disaster recovery and business continuity process, almost every single one of them has the smoking hole scenario. That is, what would happen if your building was hit by a meteor? Not what you think would happen, but always this was the scenario. And they're saying, okay, well, in order to get up and running again, we'll have to go to the local shop and get as many laptops as we can. This doesn't scale, and we have to be very cognizant of that. So we have to look at it in the perspective of security resilience and building that into our environment. How are we going to make sure that our environment is a better way to approach things and not simply based on the classical scale of a castle. We have to look at it from the positive and the negative. Because security practitioners, we're really bad at sitting back and saying, oh, everything is horrible, the end of the days. That's sort of our default, and I know I lived that for far too many years. But there is a positive as well. And when we're looking at it, when we're talking about security resilience in our environments, we're talking about it of the stuff that is pretty much the lather, rinse, repeat of the daily life of a security practitioner. Dealing with leadership buy-in, recognizing where the problem areas are, investing in your people. I don't know why we're still having this conversation 30 years into my career where we have to talk about it makes sense to invest in people. I would hope that we've gotten to the point where organizations would see this as just making sense. My favorite was, it's like, oh, well, what if we train the people and they go to another company? What if you don't train them and they stay? So building up your people is a core competency within your environment. And there are other steps there as well. And all of this is essential because we have to look at it because bad things are going to happen. Now, this is one of my favorite stories from a decade ago now. These two knuckleheads here, this picture they took and posted on Facebook. This was part of a gang that what they did is they compromised a third-party processor. They were able to change the check cards to have no limits, and then they would go around to banking machines all around Manhattan, New York, in the United States, and get as much money out of the ATMs as they possibly could. In 24 hours, they got roughly $41 million. $45 million. And they took pictures of themselves and put it on Facebook. These guys were not exactly intellectual giants. And here, come on. Oh, there we go. And here's an example of the map where all of the ATMs they hit, they had a gang of mules that would go out and just download money from the ATMs. And they have all sorts of pictures of them going through and doing it. And how was this possible? Because they had technically savvy people that were able to go in and alter the code at one point in this flow. They were able to attack in a way that wasn't seen as conventional. At one point I was asked to, in an interview for a previous role, they said, how would you hack into our company? I said, simple. I would take the CEO's admin out for lunch. What do you mean? I just asked them for their password. What if they don't give you the password? I have a brick. And they right there turned beet red because they hadn't thought of that possibility. And we have to learn to think differently when we're looking at security in our environments. So what went wrong with that particular case? We had a vulnerable institution, credit card breach processor was breached on 2 different occasions. All sorts of different pieces fell apart very quickly. And this is where security resilience and making sure that we have an environment that can withstand an attack was a miss. So we have to look at things like trust. What is trust? Trust is the belief and predictability of behaviors and outcomes within a given scope of activity. You are trusting that something is going to happen a certain way because that's the way it's supposed to happen. As security practitioners, we are building our careers on, well, what happens if I do this? What happens if I do that or that? And things would change very quickly. And this is not new. Back in 1984, Ken Thompson wrote this paper here about trusting your applications. He built a code compiler with a backdoor function in it and released it to the wild just to see what would happen. So people were using this compiler, building their applications, and each and every one of their applications that were built with this compiler had a backdoor built in. And this backdoor would change from one compilation to the next, so it was not a uniformity across the board. And you can't trust the code you didn't totally create yourself, was Ken Thompson's approach. So how do we build that trust? Well, we've got to think about that. Also, what is privacy? Now, privacy is a fun one. Privacy is the ability to keep your personal information from being known by others. And I've heard all sorts of different things like, oh, well, if you have nothing to hide, then what do you have to fear? No, I just don't want people to know my personal business. None of theirs, move on from there. And when we're looking at things like how we're monitoring people, how we're monitoring populace, we have to look at things like the Hawthorne effect, where people's behavior will demonstrably change if they know they're being watched. That's not necessarily a good thing. It's just their behavior will shift. And we're all being watched. This happens a lot. So we have to look at privacy as an engine of change and how we can improve things overall. You want to look at things within your environment and say, is your device trustworthy? Do you know the DNS that you're resolving to? Attackers love to use DNS to cause all sorts of trouble. Is the remote host you're talking to, has it been compromised? And on from there. And just because you think you know somebody doesn't mean you do. If I'm talking to Emil online, how do I know it's him? How can I be sure? These are the kind of things we have to look at. How do we establish that trust? Because hackers can look like anyone. And just because you have some sort of piece of code that says, yes, this is them, or some piece of device that says, yes, this is who they say they are, doesn't necessarily mean it is true. Driver's licenses are one that people love to use as default credentials for humans around the world. But as early as back in the early 90s, I was able to get a fake set of credentials, passport, driver's license, all the rest of it in Canada quite easily. I just go down to Yonge Street in Toronto, and I could just get that done. That has thankfully gone away. But up until 1994, there was various intelligence agencies around the world that loved Canadian passports because they were so easy to forge if you had a birth certificate from Quebec, which is a province in Canada. So we need to actually figure out how we can trust our security controls. We want to make sure, bless you, we want to make sure that we have things that are going to make sense, and we also want to make sure that we're communicating what our requirements are to the wider audience. So this is a story that I had to deal with back when I was working for a power company, and we had an outsourced developer, and I was asked on the first week on the job, say, how are they accessing our networks? What are they doing within our environment? So I said, all right, cool. I went and had a look. They would connect via VPN and authenticate and get on their day, and get on with their day and get things done. Now, the thing was, I am slightly neurodivergent, so I think things differently. So as I'm looking at it, something wasn't stirring the pot for me as I'm looking through the different code, or the different logging entries. And these are the samples that I pulled out from all the different cities that they were authenticating from and the time of day. And I thought, this is just odd. There's something about this that isn't making sense to me. And I went, okay, well, let's look at the distance. Look at the time. It would take that amount of time to travel that distance in order to get from point A to point B. Okay, something still isn't right. And then I plotted them all out on a map, dropping pins. My brain wouldn't let go of this. Well, go on. The catch, they were all using the same login. So what they were doing in order to get their job done, they were calling into one of their fellow employees who would read them off the next code on those silly little things that we used to have that would give you the next code. It would be good for a minute, and then they could log in. And there was nothing to stop them from logging in repeatedly from multiple different locations. I couldn't get mad at them because at no point did our company say, this is not how we approach things, this is not our way of doing security. No. We had to fall on our sword. We didn't give them the requirements. And that's why it's so important to communicate. Excuse me. The contractors had no security awareness training. They were using the same credentials, but there was no active monitoring in place. All of this was being logged, but nobody was looking before I joined the company. We have to figure out how we can establish trust. And when we're looking at this, it's like, how do we define trust? What is trust for the individual? And there's all sorts of too far. And there's all sorts of different models out there where people are trying to define what trust is. The problem is there's no one universally accepted model yet. And when you put your trust in a complex system, you are trusting all of it. And there are component parts that are going to fall apart. Case in point, if you are not being careful, things are going to go horribly wrong. And that ability to trust is going to be horribly fractured if there is something along the lines that can compromise that. And there are various companies out there that unfortunately have learned that lesson. Case in point, the SolarWinds attack. And this is not to beat up on the folks at SolarWinds at all. This could happen to anybody. And we have to be very cognizant of that. So how do we build trust? Well, first and foremost, we got to stop worrying about usernames and passwords. These are a deprecated notion that were put in as a temporary control back in 1962. Passwords are the equivalent of a house key. When you go out to work or wherever you happen to be going for the day, you lock your door, protect all your stuff on your way, but at no point does that actually say that your stuff is going to be safe. Because if somebody else finds your key and was able to go into your house, there's nothing to authenticate who that person is coming through the front door. Always got to break in the coffee breaks, but coffee got a little cold, so I'm going to switch to water a sec. So we have issues with trust. How do we define it? But also, we have to look at things like theft. We look at fraud. All of these different components that can come together to fracture trust if it's not well established. And the attackers know this. We have to look at things like extortion, forgery. Disinformation is rampant across the internet. That is absolutely a truism into itself. And we have to look at things like, oh, the automation did not work here. All right, so in this particular case, this is a text message that I received a couple weeks ago from ostensibly a bank in Canada saying, if you don't look at this, we're going to take away your access to your bank. The crazy thing is, if you look at the domain, it has absolutely nothing to do with the bank in question. Roughly about the exact same time, I received a text message with a link to a site that was being hosted in Singapore. And I thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. So I posted that on Twitter before it turned into a complete dumpster fire. And I said, oh, I saw this and share this information. And somebody at the CERT here in Singapore pinged me back right away, roughly about 5 minutes later, saying it's already taken down, been taken care of. And that's one of those things that really amazed me. And it helps build that trust that I know people are paying attention, know that people are taking the time to make sure that their environments are secure. Because bad things are going to happen. We just accept that, but we have to make sure that we have the process in place to address this in a timely fashion. Because if we don't, then things could get even worse if we're not careful. The internet is a wonderful thing. It's a global reach platform, but it can be abused. And it can be used to subvert trust. So we have to make sure we're building that trust out and not being so focused on the meteors that could possibly strike our buildings. So a lot of the issues that we have to contend with were not created by the internet, but they are amplified by it because it's easier for the attackers to do their thing. So how do we make things better? Well, first and foremost, one of the things that we do at Cisco, where I work, I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Dave Lewis, Global Advisory CISO at Cisco Systems. Forgot to say that at the very beginning. This is a report that we do that's freely available to anyone. And what we did was we went through and we talked to roughly just over 5,000 different companies about how they do security in their environment. Now, the fun thing about this is it was a double-blind study. Nobody knew they were talking to Cisco. And I was quite happy about that because we got unvarnished answers back. And we looked at things like how do organizations keep up with the business in order to make sure that work is getting done, and how are they doing it, and what kind of frequency are they doing refreshes. And we found that organizations that did quarterly refreshes were keeping up with the business, but on top of that, they were actually reducing the security security issues within their environment as well. And when they had that upgrade strategy, it was driven by a vendor, as an example, they had a strong tech refresh policy. But the thing here we have to be quite cognizant of, not all companies are able to do this because that is a very expensive approach. For some, great. Others, that's not really feasible. And we looked at the kind of drivers, for example, that organizations needed in order to protect their organizations needed in order to get work done was ease of integration was first and foremost. And this is where we have to talk about democratization of security. When we are dealing with our end users, you don't want to give them tools written by engineers for engineers. You want to give them something that is easy enough for them to use and yet be safe and secure. The other report, which I have been the author for a couple of years, is called the Trusted Access Report. We went through this data, and it was 13 billion login attempts over the last year, and we analyzed it and looked at the different types of trends. And in this particular slide here, we went back to 2019 and looked at the analysis. And if you look, let's see, has this one got a laser on it? Ooh, I am drunk with power. All right, so April 2020, right through to just after October 2021, there was a huge dip in authentications, and that roughly corresponds to the breadth and depth of the pandemic. So people were trying very hard to make sure they were able to get work done. They were trying their best to try and get things done on a consistent basis, keep the lights on, because otherwise they would lose and there's the jet lag. All right. Anyway, and it was really the other piece we went through and we looked at all the different countries, and the average number of devices that users were making use of from one day to the next, and Singapore came in between 3 and 4 devices per person on a daily basis. And this is really amazing to see all of these devices in play. And the type of browsers that were being used in environments and looking at how that was dispersed. For example, in financial services, you see it was tightened down to one browser basically for an environment. And that was easier for them to keep a hold on things and make sure that they were able to reduce the security issues by not having too much variety. However, in education, you don't have those sort of controls, and we found there were a lot more things going on there. And a really interesting thing, too, is with the data that we had, we were able to see that a lot of organizations still have Java in their environment. But it's not as bad as all that because some still had Flash. I wish I was making this up. Thankfully, it was less than 1%, but still, somebody needs to have a chat. We want to make sure that the tools we're making and the tools that we're implementing are going to do things that are going to help people. Because the vast majority of people that we're trying to protect are not technically savvy. In a lot of cases, they're Luddites. They just want to go in, get their email, their spreadsheets, have their coffee, and be on their day. We want to make sure we make that as easy and painless as possible for them so we don't make it more complicated, and complications lead to more security issues. Case in point, my mother, who is now 77, I would never in my life deem to try and get her to use PGP. And don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with PGP, but if you've ever used it, you know exactly, I know this guy's laughing over here, you know exactly what I mean. I still want to be invited to dinner. Now, I was able to give her other tools that she was able to use, and she was able to say, okay, wait a second, this just works. So now, my mother, who's 77, is telling all of her friends in her reading group about these different types of products that they are now implementing it because they're easy to use. They're going to improve the security for them as individuals. We want to make sure that we're reaching out and communicating that. We want to look at things like zero trust. Now, I've brought up zero trust in conversation in Singapore in the past, and I had people tell me that was a very negative connotation. And I understand that, I do. And we can call it something else. We can call it continuous trusted access or whatever makes more sense. But the idea here is about fundamentally reducing risk in the environment. You want to make sure that you're going through and iterating as to how to better improve security overall. And we want to look at the ecosystem that we have to contend with because, like we were talking about with the castle earlier, we have moved so far away from that sort of approach to securing an environment that we have a disparate number of connections that are coming into our environment. You want to be able to trust but verify. You want to be able to establish the trust in your user identities. Evaluate the devices they're using. Are they patched to current or N-1? Are you having your environment not sanitize inputs or sanitize outputs? SQL injection has been on the OS top 10 now from, well, the beginning. And it is still a problem today. This is something that we can collectively pull together and remedy. Because the attackers, they're going to try all sorts of new and exciting problems. Let's try that again. They're going to make your day horrible. There we go. So if you have an environment that's been compromised, and your usernames and passwords are now being used by an attacker to break into your environment, how do you know that they've been compromised? I've seen too many cases of studies that, probably best if I don't stand in front of the speaker. I've seen cases where, wow, this is fun. The mind is a horrible thing to taste. Okay. Yes, legitimate credentials being used. Yes, all right, back to it. Reports that said the average length of time between a data breach happening and when it was discovered was roughly 200 days, even if it's 24 hours. Think about how much damage an attacker can do in your environment in 24 hours with legitimate credentials. How do you make sure that devices that you use in your environment are patched to current N-1 and when they're accessing critical applications in order to get work done? There we go. Stolen credentials, the attackers love to do this. They'll compromise a website, take the usernames and passwords, and replay them against multiple other sites. I've seen this far too many times over the course of my career. In my previous job, we saw this on a daily basis, and it was absolutely maddening. And how did we make it go away? MFA, multi-factor authentication, trusted device. All of a sudden, the attackers couldn't get done what they wanted to get done. We want to look at things like, when we're talking about zero trust, looking at the 5 steps that we can walk through very quickly. You want to establish trust in your user identities, the devices, the user-device combination. So if I'm working for your company and suddenly I'm in Toronto, well, that's where I'm home based, they'll say, okay, that's supposed to happen. But if I'm suddenly in Sri Lanka or I'm suddenly in Australia and I'm no business being in either of those locations, all of a sudden your policy should be able to step in and say this is a problem. You want to make sure that you're securing all the connections and applications and then being able to go through and look at all this data you've collected and look for anomalies. Because anomalous behavior will continue to happen. Attackers will try to find new and exciting ways to cause you trouble. And when we're looking at the different types of authentication methods, when we went through and did the Trusted Access report, we discovered that biometrics and WebAuthn were two of the top contenders for authentication that's on the rise. Now, WebAuthn, for those of you who may not know, is part of an open standard that was put out by the W3C. So this is freely available. I highly recommend it that you go read this. This is a foundational element of what's called passwordless technology. Ostensibly, is one login and everything is done transparent for the user. So you're making it as easy as possible for the user to do things in a safe and secure fashion. We have to figure out how we're going to start to make this change. You want to build to fail. You want to make sure that when your applications go down, that they're going to do so in such a way that's transparent to the user. You don't lose that data. There used to be a notion of 5 nines. It's like, oh, as long as I hit 5 nines, my application being uptime, that's great. Honestly, in today's day and age, with all the different cloud platforms that are available, there is no reason why applications can't stay up completely. There's no reason for that. So you want to build your applications to fail. And what I mean by that is when they go down, that you can predict how they're going to respond and how they're going to recover. And it's going to be in such a way that users can't see the difference. You want to build resilient systems. The supply chain, which has been a big thing of mine for many years, has got so many different targets of opportunity for attackers. They will look for different applications they can compromise. They'll look for third parties that you're dealing with in order to inject into the stream. And this is one of those amazing things. At one company I worked at, we had 300 third-party providers that were connected into our environment. Of those 300, 16 of them were fully documented. Of them, 8 were completely documented properly. We had companies that were connecting into us with a flat network, MPLS circuits as far as the eye can see, and attackers, if they got in, could do whatever they want. We had a pen test that was done. At 9 o'clock in the morning, I came into the office, sat down, got the phone call, said, we're starting now. It's fantastic. 9:14 a.m., the phone rings again. I have my newspaper. This shows you how long ago it was. Put the newspaper down, looked at the phone. I'm like, no. Picked it up. They had the entire Active Directory. They had every router and switch in the environment. They had everything. They were decrypting the passwords for the Active Directory. These are the kind of things that are imminently avoidable. Making sure that you have a clear asset inventory within your environment, user management, device management, all of these pieces here will help reduce the risk in your environment overall. And we have to look at things like, is biometrics going to make sense for us? Whenever I talk about biometrics, there's always somebody that goes, well, yeah, what about this? That's fair. There's nothing that's 100%. There is no such thing as a silver bullet in security. If anybody tells you they're 100% secure or they're going to give you 100% security, they're lying. Run the other way. You can get to 99, but 100% is not going to happen. WebAuthn, which I was talking about earlier, this is your homework assignment besides putting together a talk and submitting it to a local event. Read this. This is a better way forward for us collectively. Because we keep seeing things in a negative light. And that makes sense why when we look at stuff like Shodan. Show of hands in here. How many people are familiar with Shodan.io, the website? All right. I'm now assigning more homework. Go look up Shodan.io. It is basically Google for hackers. It catalogs all the devices that are freely available on the internet and what ports they're running and protocols and all the rest of it. It is quite eye-opening. In one environment I was working for, we found that our entire fab that did our circuitry was exposed on the internet. All of it. And only because I did a cursory search on Shodan that nobody had done before in our environment. This is the problem when we're building things out and we think we're doing things to either save time or cut corners, bad things can happen accidentally. So if you have a vulnerability that you've known about for 10 years, it can come back to haunt you. I don't know if anybody is familiar with this one or remembers this one. WannaCry was so much fun. When we're dealing with security, we worry about threats. We tend to get very much wrapped around the axle as to what we're going to be concerned about today. We have to look at the strategy and how we're going to have a firm foundation so that we don't get into analysis paralysis. Because I was perfectly guilty of this earlier in my career. I wasn't able to get things done because I was too busy worrying about. So, trust and privacy, these are key elements that we have to concern ourselves with in order to make sure that we're having a clearer focus in improving security overall. Not just for our individuals, not for our organizations, not just for Singapore, but the world. We can do better. So, part of what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine almost a year ago now, I felt helpless. I didn't know how I could do something positive. And I didn't want to join one of the hacker armies that were spinning up because I understood their motivation, but on the same token, I was still subject to the laws of my respective jurisdiction. So I didn't do that. But it turned out at Cisco, we had a threat intel team that was gathering open source information, and they said I was more than welcome, to be part of this. And I was able to go through and help in that environment. And then this message came through. We had somebody that was looking for food and water in Kharkiv, and they wanted to find out how they could get this information. This was very early days in the war. So this was Kharkiv before. Now, I asked a couple of friends looking for information on how I could find food and water. This is not my forte. I'm an old hacker. I've got the gray beard. I've earned this gray. I don't know how to find food and water in a country that I've never been to, in a city I've never seen. So I asked friends, because this is what we need to do. We have to build that community. Thankfully, I was able to do that. And one friend of mine referred me to somebody in Europe, that's as far as I was willing to go there, who was able to connect me up with the right people. So this person was able to put me in touch with a chain of trust. And what that was basically a phone tree. One person would call the next person, and basically pass the message down the line. We were able to arrange transportation for this family, a husband, wife, and a toddler, in order to get to a train. So this was in Kharkiv, which is over there. Boink. And they had to get down to there, Lviv. And I apologize if I'm butchering the names. But that was a 24-hour ride on a train. And ultimately, we got them to Warsaw. This was quite an event, especially if they had stayed behind. This was a few days later from roughly where they were living. They had thought they would stick it out and they would make it through, and they said, okay, we're just going to make it through the day and we're sure everything will be fine. Thankfully, they listened to reason and they left. But when they got to the border, the really interesting was, how are we going to get them anywhere? Again, same problem. We don't know anybody local. Thankfully, I reached out to another friend at another security company who, with a bunch of other people, had gotten together and built out this spreadsheet. Now, I've obfuscated it for obvious reasons, but this spreadsheet was a list of people, contacts that had vehicles that were willing to meet people escaping the country at the border and get them to a safe location. This is just a shoestring of people pulled together and getting it done. This was a community. And this was a conversation that we were having. And the friend, I didn't know where to send them because we didn't have housing for them. But my friend who lives in Warsaw said, well, we got room in my house. We'll put them up. Thankfully, that didn't have to come to pass. They were able to get lodging north of the city. But it was just literally people coming together in order to get it done. And thankfully, this had a very happy ending for that family. This just shows, simply by having conversations, me reaching out on Twitter and then having somebody from the certain Singapore just taking care of a problem, just reaching out and talking to people that you know were able to rescue a family from a city. We have to look beyond point solutions. We have to look at a wider conversation to make sure that we're raising all boats. Because when we get so heavily focused on that smoking hole scenario where the meteor hits the building, we're losing focus on how we're reducing risk and improving security overall. We want to make sure that we're building trust and resilience in our environments with our folks to make sure that we're getting to a better place. Because if one of these lines is cut in just the wrong place, it could all fall apart. So we need a much stronger web built out. We need to build out that sense of community. And with that sense of community, we have that safety in numbers. And that's why I love events like SINCON, because it's bringing together a community. I came all the way here from Canada. Quite literally, there is no reason, based on what loosely I know about some of the folks in this room, there's no reason why the entire roster at the next SINCON isn't all locals. I would love to see that. I would come to see that. And we did that in Toronto. I was one of the founders of B-Sides Toronto, and one year we had all first-year speakers, nobody that had ever given a talk before, all lived locally, and they did a fantastic job. There was a lot of very terrified people, a couple people threw up, but they did a great job, and they felt better for taking the time there. We want to make sure that we are growing from where we are. We want to make sure that when we're looking at security in our environments, that we're figuring out ways that we can reload. We can get to a better place. Excuse me. We have done things the way we have done them for so long that it's very hard for us to shift our thinking. We get lost in the minutia. We want to make sure that we're rolling back to the beginning and reload so that we can make sure that we're getting to that better place. And Singapore has the ability here in this room to lead by example. You need to believe in yourselves. You can steer this boat. You can be a shining light for the rest of the planet. So get her done. Thank you very much.